Living Cape Coral. Good morning and grand rising. It's wonderful to be here. I have to say, I was there last week. It felt really good. As I was preparing to come on today, reflecting back to being there last weekend, it felt like it was a month ago. I don't understand like where, how, why time moves the way that it is, but it just feels kind of strange. It was really surreal when I had to like really piece it together. Like, yep, that was really only 7 days ago. So life is interesting, and I just want you to know I miss you. It was great being there last week, so I look forward to being back there in a couple weeks. Okay, so trauma 101. The first thing that I will ask is whoever's helping me with slides today, if we'll put that first image up. So just looking at this image, well, I hope we have an image. Okay, I'm not sure. I don't see it, so just in case. Oh, okay, yeah. And then the next image is a group of people. So looking at this image, can you tell which person has experienced trauma? It's kind of hard from just looking at somebody. You really can't tell. And now there's 10 people in this image, and here's the thing. 7 of these people will experience some form of, significant form of trauma some point in their life if they haven't already. So that's something to consider. When you look at a group of people, statistically, 7 of those people right there could be, having the effects that come from experiencing trauma in their life. So, one thing that we want to kind of address here, we're talking about this idea of the unstatus quo. Some of these subjects that are difficult to talk about, a lot of times that we might kind of brush over them in our spiritual communities. Trauma is one that it can conjure, it can trigger, emotions that we maybe didn't even know we were holding, or, ones that we've known that we were holding, but it can come up just all of a sudden. So I guess this is somewhat of a trigger warning. We're calling it Trauma 101 because we're really just coming in at the surface. And at that same time, though, just even using that word can be enough to, trigger or, kind of ignite that trauma response within people. And so I just want everybody to know. I want everybody to feel safe, to know like I'm not going to go too deep into this. And at that same time, if something comes up for you, it's perfectly okay to, if you need to get up and excuse yourself, if you need to, if you're watching at home and you just need to take a minute, it's perfectly okay. And these are normal responses. And, that's part of what we are using today's talk for, is to make it more acceptable and understanding for people to ask for what they need. And so if for some reason something comes up, by all means, step out. And on top of that, we're really lucky to be at a Center for Spiritual Living, and especially in Cape Coral, because we have 12 practitioners who are all trained to listen and to be present and hold consciousness for people. So at the same time, if today or anytime, if something comes up for you that, has given a trauma kind of response in your body, I want you to reach out, get a hold of a practitioner, do what you need to do to help process it. All that being said, let's go ahead and jump in a little further here. So I'm going to ask for, well, we could say that in 1 second. So the first part we want to talk about is how trauma can affect us. And you may recall, it's been a while now, at least a year, I think, since I talked about ACEs. ACEs it stands for Adverse Childhood Experience. And so we've done a lot, or I shouldn't say we, psychologists and others have done a lot of studies around ACEs and trauma, and we've come a long ways of how we understand things that affect us. And the study of these adverse childhood experiences, of these ACEs, have led to profound insights. And so we know that for anybody who has experienced a significant amount of ACEs, and essentially they've categorized them into about 10 different sections. And if anybody has experienced 3 or more, your chances of being incarcerated, of suffering from other, emotional, not disorders, but emotional distresses, all of these things are greatly affected. If you have 6 or more of them, your life expectancy drops by about 19 years. And so it's really important for us to explore, what has transpired in our lives, to process what has transpired, and to help be there for others. So, along with ACEs, talking about the childhood experiences, which can be anything, from neglect, from abuse. It can be living in a household where substance abuse was an issue. It can be having a close family member who was incarcerated. It can be physical abuse, mental abuse, food insecurity, living in poverty, living homeless. All these different things are ACEs. And if you are, children that have experienced it, it's tough. And here's the thing though, like, yes, ACEs are very important to study and they've led us to a lot of insights. At that same time, trauma doesn't end after childhood. And so all these experiences, they continue to cause injury within adults, within human beings, as it doesn't just apply to our childhoods. So we are always kind of accumulating more. And so when we get to learn the tools, this is why I really love Centers for Spiritual Living and New Thought Religions, is because it helps us develop these tools of meditation, of intentional prayer and contemplation, and working with others in communication, introspection. All of these things really help us discover what's going on inside and helps us to live fuller lives and more enjoyable lives, and quite often longer lives. When we start factoring in people that have experienced trauma, how quite often their lives get even cut short, whether it's through taking the people that take their own lives, people that react in ways that trauma has caused irrational thought processes, and people end up in jail. They end up in other situations. They end up in bad relationships. And so our traumas, they never stop. They're always happening, but we can learn tools to help us process and work through it a little bit better. And that, again, Centers for Spiritual Living has been a lifesaver for me, just in ways that it has helped me uncover things in my psyche that have kind of maybe been hidden down, stuffed down, that once I'm aware of them, then I can start to process and work through them. So I will ask for the next slide that comes up. This is something that came up on an article I read about funny quotes on Twitter. And I don't know if I necessarily find this one so funny as much as it is telling. So I'll read it for anybody that's not able to see it. It says, "Trauma is so silly. Like, wow, something upset me so badly as a child that it has warped my entire perception of life every day following it. You're telling me my brain can't realize it wasn't my fault and live a normal life now? I gotta be haunted by it forever?" And unfortunately, that's kind of a true statement for many people, because just the study of trauma and how it affects our lives is relatively new. Maybe 50 years that we've really started to unpack how these things affect and impact us for the rest of our life. And so we don't necessarily have to live with it and let it haunt us the rest of our lives, but so many people do. And that's kind of where I want to finish with. If anybody watched the teaser, you'll see where I'm going with that. Like, everybody, we never know who out there is in a moment of suffering, in a moment of pain, and how we show up impacts and changes the future that we share collectively. Because no one is an island. We are all connected, and talking's good. It hasn't always appeared that way. I know, like in my life, growing up, just kind of the norms of the 70s, I would say, is like talking about our problems wasn't necessarily encouraged so much. It was, you have to put on that image. You are strong, and, boys don't cry. These kind of, sayings that we learn in and lived by, they're outdated. And we've learned that the more we open up, just by opening up, Michael Singer had a quote, and I wish I had it in front of me. It was something about when we open up, energy comes in, and energy has the power to heal, especially when it's love. And so there is a dynamic, and that's where, I'll put in a plug here for the Grievers Circle that's coming up. These kind of groups, when we come together and we discuss the traumas that we've experienced, discuss, the losses that we've experienced, which is a form of trauma as well. Healing, it is cathartic to get to share this out in the open. And there's also a synergistic effect that when we see somebody else processing their traumas and sharing their experience with us, it's healing for us to see others heal, if that makes sense to anyone. So that's really where I want to encourage people to go, is to open up. Centers for Spiritual Living, Ernest Holmes has talked to us a lot about, what we think of is what we bring about. And so we've got this thing in Centers for Spiritual Living where we are afraid of what we talk about. Like, if I talk about my past trauma, then that means I'm going to create more of it. I'm going to, stay in it, and it's going to continue to influence me. So that is kind of where a toxic form of spirituality, we call it toxic spirituality, when we are afraid to talk about something, afraid to address what's there, because we have this almost a superstitious fear that if I talk about it, it's going to happen again. It's going to bring it about. But here's the thing, is we can't heal what we're afraid to look at. It's the same thing when, in a physical injury, if you have a cut or something, it's got to be cleaned. It's got to be, processed, exposed, cleaned, treated, and then bandaged up in order for it to heal properly. It's the same thing with the feelings inside of us, with our, emotions and our traumatized feelings. If we can't explore them, they're always going to be underneath, kind of running a program in our subconscious that will unintentionally push good things away from us. It'll, I talked about it a little bit last week, I believe, when we unintentionally sabotage ourselves. It's an unconscious thing that, from a childhood experience of somebody leaving, that when you grow older, anytime you start getting close to somebody in a relationship, you unintentionally sabotage it and wonder why you never get past a certain point in these relationships. It's that example that shows up in all these different ways of how we can push away the good from us. And so here in Centers for Spiritual Living, as we do our work, as we go within in meditation, as we open up to discover, what unconscious beliefs am I holding that could be keeping me from moving forward in life? So when we start to explore them and start to do replacement techniques, which is where spiritual mind treatment can come in, is changing the consciousness that we hold around whatever experiences it is that we have kind of maybe stuffed down and forgotten that are there. Then we can start to show up and show others. And so again, Centers for Spiritual Living, we are on the cutting edge of creating a new world, a new way of being, a shift in consciousness. And it begins with coming to these places and having these conversations. I've spoken before about New Thought religions from the very beginning, from the very origins in the late 1800s, has attracted people who are looking to heal something, sometimes something physical, especially in those early days when medical technology wasn't what it is today, but also mental healing. So it's, first off, spiritual seekers, in my take and opinion, are emotionally and intellectually and spiritually, and I don't mean this like in a hierarchical kind of way, but there's an evolution happening. And so people that are moving us towards a new way of being, a more open, sharing, loving place, are the ones that are starting to have those insights like, there's something within me that I could heal. There's something in me that could be better. And through that, one of the outlets that we find is spiritual centers where we can come and share with others, go in our classes, learn the techniques to help us discover what's going on inside. And when we do that, we start to show others out in the world that there is hope. There is healing to be had. And, if you would like to engage, do the things that we do. And that's how we continue to grow and move on forward. So individually, it is important to unpack and just ask ourselves what's there. If we've been stuffing stuff down, I want to encourage you to get the support that you need, because it's really important that we don't, this can be challenging to do on our own. And so to have friends or community members, to have a practitioner that you do paid sessions with, if you have a therapist, utilize these things. But I want to encourage and invite us to no longer keep things stuffed down. All of that, it's like the ticking time bomb. It's down there, it's just waiting, and hurt comes out in the least expected times, and inevitably in the times where we least could use it. And it's important for us to help create this new world of being, is to know what's there so that we don't unintentionally come out and harm others. So on an individual level, we've got that to do. And like I said, it doesn't end after childhood. We still have things happening, but we learn these tools so that when new things come up, when we share in our experiences, then we know the tools to kind of help process them so that we don't end up creating more unhealed wounds that are just waiting to lash out to others. So that's on the individual level. Now, trauma, we experience things collectively as well. And another, conversation that can be hard to have is what's going on in our world, what's going on in our country, with the divisiveness that we see, arguments over, who needs what, whose needs aren't being met, who's marginalized, how do we act to people. All of these things sometimes can be, shied away from in centers for spiritual living, because they can come across, some people interpret them as being political. And when we know that all thought, like everything in the world, starts and stems from thought, from consciousness. So if we just continue to ignore these problems that are clearly problems, if it's something that we can't come together in Congress, if we can't come together in our families and talk about certain subjects, that means that there's hurt there, there's trauma there, and we will never get past it without the ability to see it, to talk about it. And collectively, I'll just use the United States as an example. The traumas that we have experienced, going back to the very, to the first time when Christopher Columbus, landed on our shores, we pretty much instantly began in genocide of an entire, race. The first American peoples, the American Indians, were decimated. We experienced slavery. And since then we've had, natural disasters. We've had other marginalized communities that are taught and talked about in the public as if they are less than. We have lots of people that are healing, or that are hurting, that need to be healing. And fortunately, we do have a lot that are in the process of healing as well, but we have more. And having the conversations that make us uncomfortable is important, because here's the thing, like, generational trauma exists, and it continues and it perpetuates, and we have conversations that are wanting to happen all over the place, but they make a lot of people uncomfortable. And so it's this constant back and forth. And what I think a lot of people miss is that generations and descendants of people who, whose families were involved, or who were slaves, there's an anger. And I experienced this from kind of an outside perspective of, as a white person, when I went with my parents to, it was the Great Irish Hunger Museum, and that's in Hamden, Connecticut. But when you see it, of what caused the Great Famine of the Irish, or how it was reacted to by England, who were their rulers, who still wanted to come and take the taxes, and they also ignored like that starving that everybody was going on in the country. There was a lot of anger. There was a lot of trauma that was experienced through that. And just learning about something that happened with your ancestors generations ago has an effect within you. And I am a firm believer that our generational and ancestral history is within, that we carry it in our physical bodies. And just seeing that, like, it was an experience for me of, I was feeling anger towards, the English of that time. I was feeling sadness for the families and the loss. And we learned about the ghost ships that showed up, in New York, that was just filled with deceased people, and all of that created this experience. And so while I'm not a Black American and I can't relate to that experience directly, I can kind of imagine like there's that same kind of thing, that we are holding on to generations of pain and anger, and we want to heal, and as a collective we have to. And so when there's groups of people that are standing up to say, like, we're not being heard, that's trauma that's coming up. And so we cannot continue just to heal individually. We have to heal collectively, and in order to do that, we have to have collective conversations. We have to be willing to address what happened in the past, take responsibility for what's ours to do moving forward, listen to people, let people know that they've been heard, and most importantly, give me just 1 second here. One thing that I don't know that we necessarily realize is we have all the people, the direct descendants of these traumas, that are still traumatized, but the people, the descendants of the slave owners, of what we would label as oppressors, there's trauma there too. You can't be a witness to inhumane treatment and not be traumatized by it. And I know, early slaveholders, I've seen, this at the African American Museum of History in Washington, D.C., and then also the one in Charleston. We see quotes that people used to justify things in their head of how we let such horrific things go on. But you can't fool yourself. You can fool yourself intellectually to say, like, this has to happen this way. It's okay. Whatever excuses were made, 400 years ago and since then, that justify, like, it's okay that this has happened, that this is just part of human history, whatever all these reasonings were. You can't fool what in your heart is wrong. You can't fool, like, your subconscious. You can't fool your spirit. So we can't trick ourselves out of the traumatic experiences of the past. So where I want to really leave this with is, yes, we have massive need for healing, but the healing is happening, and it's progressed. And in decade after decade, into these last decades, we have learned tons of tools of just knowing that there is healing in talking. There's healing in prayer, in sitting and meditating, and that is happening, and it continues to grow. And there's resistance to it because change is hard, and looking at these difficult parts of our past is really hard, and sometimes it's unbearable. Unbearable for the victims of traumatic experiences, of course, and even for people that aren't necessarily victimized. It's still really hard to look at things within our psyche. Traumas, we have this tendency as human beings to want to, list things from worst to least bad or whatever. But it's all relative. Everybody has experienced something in their life that they didn't like, something that was challenging for them. And oftentimes you'll hear people who have experienced, significant traumas that will still downplay and say, but it's not, it's not that bad, because at least it's not as bad as what happened to Joe over there. Like, he went through this and that, and he's got a real reason to be upset. No, we got to let all of those things go, all those stigmas, and just know if there's something in you that has caused pain, it requires healing. But we do have tools to do that, and we can show up and help one another. So the last thing, and this is where I was going earlier in the talk when I talked about reference the teaser for this week. And I'm going to read this quote one more time. It's from Robert Anton Wilson. He said, "Under the present brutal and primitive conditions on this planet, every person you meet should be regarded as one of the walking wounded. We have never seen a person not slightly deranged by either anxiety or grief. We have never seen a totally sane human being." And that, depending on where you're at and what your understanding is, that may come across as inaccurate. But the more I think about it and looked at it, every single experience that we have shapes us in a way. And so when we want to deny, and say like, oh, those things that happened to me weren't that bad, and we downplay them, we can't fool what's inside. We can't fool our heart and our spirit. And so when we're out there in the world, my mission, like the gist of my whole ministry, is I want to see this world that I've heard about in Centers for Spiritual Living, that create the world that works for everyone. I firmly believe that that is possible, and that we are doing that. And I firmly believe that it can happen in my lifetime. And so one of the ways to really help bring that around, and, again, me, it's, going to sound like that broken record, how we show up, the tiniest little things that you might think are insignificant have huge ripple effects. And so if I want to err on the side of more compassion, I'm going to assume that who's ever there in front of me, that they are suffering on some level. And this isn't a way of pity. It isn't a way to think less of anybody at all, because we all have our experiences. It's just to remind myself, when I see somebody that's smiling and happy, I can still assume that that person's had experiences, but I can, come from this place of deeper compassion, of deeper caring and love for that person. And it's easy in those situations. And my mind's not going to jump to like, oh, this person has probably suffered at some point in their life. Because here they seem well-adjusted, happy, and, creating more happiness and smiles in the world. But now if I can take that same idea, and when somebody's lashing out at me, when somebody, whether it's somebody out road rage, or somebody that's gotten upset over something in a store or whatever, people are triggered and things come up all the time. And people that are hurt, you come from that place of trauma, and it's a reactionary thing. And so a lot of times when people are in their emotional state, it's real easy to want to butt heads and just go right back with them. If somebody says something nasty to you, you can't let that slide, right? Or can you? Right? I remember growing up that it was a big thing. Like if somebody dissed you, you can't let that go. You have to, whatever it is, you have to speak up against them. When real little, you have to fight him. You have to, at least challenge him. All of these things, and it all comes down to ego. Like, I personally, if I know that somebody tries to insult me, somebody says something mean, something harsh, I don't have to let that affect me. What I want to encourage us all to do is to find our self-worth within. We are children of the infinite, of the divine, a spark. As Jesus said, the Son of God, we are all the children of God. And learning to not let anybody get through to me, it's a challenge. But one way that helps me is when I can remember if somebody's lashing out at me, that person's hurting. And so if I can come back, and respond with love, that makes the world a better place. I'll quickly end with this. I say quickly, I'm going to do my best. I've told this story before, but it was when back in my waiting tables time, I had one customer that was just so awful. He said really awful things, and it was interaction to where like it took everything I got. And it happened at a time when it was perfect in my life where I was ready for it. And it was really challenging not to react and respond to that person with what he was throwing at me. And right around that same time, I had another customer that was that I was waiting on, that was quiet, polite. But I asked, something about like, how are you doing? And something told this guy that he was going to be honest with me. He's like, you know what? I'm really not doing well. We were real close to the Denver General Hospital, and he's like, I've been going over to the hospital every day, and my wife's there. Well, she's dying, and he felt okay telling me this, and I was just like, I really felt for him. But I put those two customers' experience together. The one person that was acting so rudely, so poorly, had I just given it right back, which was up before then, was my MO. I wouldn't let somebody slide for saying something like that to me. But then I had the realization, if I had reacted and said nasty things to that person, or pointed out how horrible he was being, if I had found out that that person had just lost his wife or spouse, or was going through the process of watching a loved one die of a disease, if I gave that right back to him, and then I found out how much pain this person was experiencing, I would feel horrible about myself. There's no justification for treating people awful. There's no justification for that, but there is reasons where we can understand why it might happen. The person that's suffering the loss, it's understandable that they might not be their best self, and they might react poorly in situations. Now, if I come in and respond poorly to that because my ego got a little bruised because somebody called me a name, to me, that's not okay. It's not okay. So, not knowing which one of those 7 people has experienced the trauma, then it falls on me to just treat everybody with the same respect and the same understanding and kindness and compassion. And that's where I'd like to encourage us all to go. That's how we make the world into a better place, is by getting away from our knee-jerk reactions and opening up into our more informed and better ways of being. And there's actually a thing called trauma-informed care, trauma-informed action, that leads us to show up in the world coming from a place of assuming everybody that we see has suffered at some point. So with that being said, I'm going to ask the slide person to move it forward one more time, please. And we'll get to our spiritual principle this week. Is we believe in the healing of the sick and control of conditions through the power of this mind. So spiritual mind treatment absolutely has power for healing. And sometimes traumas and other things require a little bit more love. So we have a saying, we treat and we move our feet. So when we do our prayer, yes, you do your prayer work, and you also do the practices that help move it forward. On the next slide is our spiritual practice for this week. And it's, again, self-awareness. This is what we had last week as well. Self-awareness is a willingness to observe and take responsibility for one's internal and external choices. We are responsible for ourselves and how we show up in the world. And personally, my mission is to help usher in a new way of being on this planet, where we can respect one another no matter what our beliefs are, where we can comfort one another, because we're all human beings. We are all so connected. One person's trauma affects everyone around them, and so it's very important. And so through the self-awareness as a spiritual practice, there's many ways, but working with a practitioner is a wonderful way. Meditation, taking our classes. We go through processes in these classes, all kinds of different techniques that help us uncover things that we have stuffed down and didn't know that they're unconsciously driving the bus, and sometimes in harmful ways for us. So with that, we'll finish with our affirmation for the week, which is, I am gentle with myself and the world, knowing we are all healing together. So I'm not able to hear you, but let's say it all together if you're in agreement with this, and really take it into heart if it resonates with you. If not, that's okay. You have other things to work on. So we'll say this together. I am gentle with myself and the world, knowing we are all healing together. So just like Linda said, and after the reading, Ram Dass said, we're all just walking each other home. It's really what we're doing. We're here to have this experience until we go back home and we create new experiences, new iterations of life. So let's go ahead and take this within, opening up to that one presence, opening up to a space in the center of your heart, knowing that there is one love, one life that connects all of us, and it's always seeking higher expression. It's always seeking to bring out what we call the God qualities, the best qualities that make life enjoyable, that make it worth living. So I know that each and every one of us is a broad spectrum of life experiences, and that it all contributes to making us into the bigger and best things, best people and beings that we can. And it all depends on how we show up from that best place. So I affirm and avow right now that Spirit carries each one of us, that we are led, we are guided, and we are receiving the tools and the strength needed in order to process our own personal traumas, in order to be there to help and witness others process their traumas, and then showing up in a world, having the hard conversations, recognizing that we are collectively healing from past traumas as well, and then being informed as we move forward to create a world with intention where we can start to minimize the amount of traumas that happen. Unnecessary traumas we can eliminate, and I know that Spirit is here giving the tools to one another to remind us of the love that resides within. So in gratitude for everyone doing their individual work, in gratitude for the creative mechanism of the universe that takes our words, our thoughts, our actions, and creates that into our collective reality, I say thank you for it all. And I just release these words and affirm it as being by saying, and so it is. So it is.